They sat across from the most powerful hosts in television, dazzling audiences with charm the cameras loved. But charm has a cost, and behind every perfect interview was a story the public never saw. Some fought addiction in silence. Some destroyed friendships with a single sentence. Some collapsed the moment the lights went off. This is the real, documented history of Hollywood's most electric guests, the stories confirmed by biographers, co-stars, and the hosts who sat closest to them. Not rumors. Not guesses. The truth behind the legend. Number 1 on this list changed the literary world, then nearly burned every bridge in it. Judy Garland was singing and performing before she was old enough to understand what fame would cost her. By 17, she was already a global star as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. What audiences didn't see was that MGM had been giving her amphetamines to keep her energy up for grueling filming schedules, then sedatives to bring her down at night, a cycle that started her dependency on pills before she had even finished growing up. That early damage followed her for the rest of her life. Garland struggled publicly with addiction to prescription medication for decades, along with documented suicide attempts that were reported in the press at the time, something almost unheard of for a star of her stature during that era. She was fired from multiple film productions, including Annie Get Your Gun in 1949, when her unreliability and health made her uninsurable for the studio. Her financial situation was just as unstable as her health. Despite being one of the highest-paid entertainers of her generation, Garland was broke multiple times throughout her adult life, the result of mismanagement, expensive divorces, and years lost to treatment rather than work. She was married 5 times, and each marriage ended amid public scrutiny of her struggles. Yet she kept coming back. Her 1961 comeback concert at Carnegie Hall is still remembered as one of the greatest live performances in American music history, proof that her talent never actually left her, even when everything else in her life was falling apart. The recording won multiple Grammy Awards and reintroduced her to a new generation. Her television appearances in the late 1960s showed the visible toll of those decades. Audiences who remembered the bright-eyed girl from Oz were now watching a woman clearly exhausted by her own life, her voice still remarkable, her presence still magnetic, but fragile in a way that was impossible to ignore. Judy Garland died in 1969 at 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, would go on to build her own celebrated career. Garland left behind one of the most beloved voices in entertainment history and a life that showed exactly what early fame, without protection, can do to a child who never had the chance to just be a child. Bette Davis didn't just survive Hollywood's golden age, she dominated it through sheer force of will. 2 Academy Awards, 10 nominations, and a reputation as one of the fiercest, most demanding presences on any set. But that reputation wasn't built on talent alone. It was built on decades of real conflict, real rivalries, and a refusal to soften herself for anyone. The most famous of those rivalries was with Joan Crawford. It wasn't studio-invented gossip. The 2 women genuinely despised each other, a tension that started decades earlier over roles, men, and status, and never cooled. When they were finally cast together in 1962's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the set became legendary for real hostility. Crew members documented the friction for years afterward. Davis reportedly kept a scorecard of small victories against her rival, and neither woman hid her contempt when asked about the other in interviews. Davis's talk show appearances in the 70s and 80s became must-watch television for a different reason. She had stopped performing graciousness. She said exactly what she thought, about directors, about co-stars, about the industry that had both made her and repeatedly tried to discard her as she aged. Hosts learned to simply let her talk, because interrupting Bette Davis rarely ended well for the interviewer. She smoked constantly, a habit she made no attempt to hide or apologize for, treating the cigarette almost like a prop that punctuated her sharpest lines. It became part of her persona, the tough, unbothered survivor who had outlasted the men who once controlled her career. Her personal life was its own battlefield. For marriages, all of which ended, and a long, publicly bitter estrangement from her daughter B.D. Hyman, who published a memoir in 1985 accusing Davis of being a cruel and abusive mother. Davis never accepted the accusations quietly. She fought back publicly, in interviews, refusing to let the narrative be written without her voice in it. By the time she reached her final years, illness had taken a visible toll, including a stroke and a mastectomy that she discussed candidly rather than concealed. Even then, she kept working, kept appearing, kept giving audiences the same unfiltered honesty that had defined her from the start. Bette Davis died in 1989 at 81. She left behind one of the greatest bodies of work in American film, a decades-long rivalry that never resolved, and a reputation for fearlessness that few in Hollywood, before or since, have matched. John Wayne built an image so powerful it became bigger than the man himself. The square jaw, the slow drawl, the unshakable confidence, he turned into the walking symbol of the American West. But behind that symbol was a real man fighting real battles that had nothing to do with a movie script. In 1964, Wayne was diagnosed with lung cancer. Doctors removed his entire left lung and 2 ribs in a procedure so serious that most people didn't survive it, let alone return to work. Wayne didn't just survive. He went public with it himself, a rare move at a time when cancer was treated as something to hide in silence. He called it the Big C and dared it to try to define him. It didn't. He kept making films for another 15 years. His commitment to a certain vision of America went far beyond the screen. He was one of Hollywood's most outspoken conservative voices, an active supporter of anti-communist politics throughout the 50s and 60s, and closely tied to organizations pushing that same message. In 1960, he personally financed, directed, and starred in The Alamo, pouring his own money into the project because he believed in the story so deeply that studios backing away from it didn't stop him. That same bluntness got him into serious trouble in 1971, when a Playboy interview captured him making comments about race and Native Americans that were widely condemned as ignorant and offensive, even at the time. Wayne never fully walked the comments back. He stood by his worldview publicly, refusing to perform an apology he didn't feel. Through all of it, the cigarettes never stopped. He smoked 5 to 6 packs a day for decades, a habit directly tied to the cancer that first took his lung and would eventually return. In his final television appearances in the late 70s, his voice had grown noticeably rougher, his frame thinner, though he kept the same easy humor that had carried him through 40 years of stardom. Stomach cancer was diagnosed in 1979. He died that same year at 72. John Wayne remains one of the most awarded, most quoted, and most politically divisive actors in American film history, a man whose real battles, on screen and off, were every bit as defining as the legend built around him. Walter Matthau made a career out of playing the grouchy, disheveled everyman, and the strange part is, he barely had to act. The rumpled suits, the deadpan delivery, the constant air of exhausted irritation, much of it was simply Matthau being Matthau in front of a camera. His real addiction wasn't alcohol or drugs. It was gambling. Matthau lost staggering amounts of money at racetracks and casinos over the course of his life, at one point admitting publicly that he had gone through nearly $5 million chasing bets. He wasn't secretive about it either. He joked about his losses on talk shows the same way other guests joked about bad dates, treating financial ruin as just another punchline in his ongoing act. In 1966, that lifestyle nearly killed him. Matthau suffered a serious heart attack while filming The Odd Couple, the film that would go on to define his career alongside Jack Lemmon. He recovered and kept working, but the heart problems never fully went away, resurfacing again in later decades and requiring further treatment. His partnership with Jack Lemmon became one of the most enduring in Hollywood history, spanning more than a dozen films across nearly 4 decades. Off-screen, the two were genuinely close friends, a real bond that outlasted trends, studios, and their own aging careers. Their chemistry wasn't manufactured for the cameras. It was one of the rare authentic friendships that Hollywood partnerships are often accused of faking. Matthau's talk show appearances leaned entirely into his real personality, self-deprecating, unbothered by vanity, willing to mock his own reputation for sloppiness before anyone else could. He never tried to appear polished, and audiences loved him precisely because he refused to pretend. He continued acting well into his 70s, appearing in Grumpy Old Men alongside Lemon in 1993, a film that essentially let him play an exaggerated version of the same cranky charm he'd built his entire career on. Walter Matthau died in 2000 at 79, following ongoing heart complications. He left behind an Oscar, one of cinema's great comedic partnerships, and a public persona so consistent with his private one that audiences never had to separate the actor from the man. Truman Capote was, for a brief period, the most fascinating guest in American television. Small, sharp-voiced, and endlessly quotable, he turned every talk show appearance into an event. Audiences didn't tune in for calm conversation. They tuned in because Capote said things no one else dared to say on camera. He had already written two of the defining works of American literature, Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. The second book alone took him 6 years of obsessive research, embedding himself with killers, court records, and a small Kansas town that never fully recovered from his presence. That project changed journalism forever, but it also changed Capote. Friends and biographers agree the years spent close to real-life murderers left him changed, more anxious, more restless, and increasingly dependent on alcohol to cope with what he had witnessed. By the 1970s, his television appearances told a different story than his early fame. He was still brilliant, still quick with a devastating line, but the toll was visible. He had become dependent on alcohol and prescription medication, something he never fully hid and occasionally joked about on air, using humor to deflect concern. Then came the moment that defined his final decade. In 1975, Capote published a chapter from an unfinished novel called Answered Prayers in Esquire magazine. The excerpt exposed thinly disguised secrets of his closest friends, the wealthy, high-society women he called his swans. He assumed they would forgive him. They didn't. Nearly every one of them cut him off completely, and that social circle never let him back in. It was one of the most self-destructive career decisions in literary history, and Capote spent his remaining appearances defending it, half proud and half devastated by what he had lost. His later interviews grew harder to watch. His speech slowed. His stories drifted. Hosts who once eagerly booked him began treating him more gently, aware that the man in front of them was fighting battles the audience could only guess at. He continued making public appearances almost until the end, refusing to disappear quietly. Truman Capote died in 1984 at 59 years old. He left behind two books that reshaped American writing, one unfinished manuscript that cost him nearly every friendship he had, and a public decline that unfolded, piece by piece, in front of the cameras he once controlled so effortlessly. Clark Gable was called the King of Hollywood, and for most of the 1930s and 40s, no one seriously argued with the title. Gone with the Wind alone cemented him as the definitive leading man of his era. But the real Gable, away from that polished image, carried losses that shaped him far more than any award. The deepest of those losses was his wife, actress Carole Lombard. The two had one of the most genuine, well-documented love stories in Hollywood history, a marriage that friends described as authentically happy in an industry full of arranged unions. In January 1942, Lombard was killed in a plane crash while returning from a war bond tour, at just 33 years old. Gable was reportedly devastated beyond anything his public image had ever suggested. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces almost immediately afterward, at 41 years old, flying combat missions during World War II, a decision many close to him linked directly to his grief. He never fully recovered the same lightness after her death. His later marriages, 3 more in total, never carried the same public warmth, and colleagues often noted a heaviness in him that hadn't existed before 1942. Gable was also a lifelong heavy smoker and drinker, habits common to his generation but ones he never moderated even as his health began to decline. By the early 1960s, still working steadily, his physical toll was becoming visible on screen, though he refused to slow down. In 1960, he filmed The Misfits alongside Marilyn Monroe, a notoriously difficult production plagued by delays, extreme heat, and Monroe's own well-documented struggles on set. Gable insisted on performing many of his own physically demanding stunts despite being 59 years old, reportedly determined not to be treated as fragile. Days after filming wrapped, Gable suffered a massive heart attack. He died on November 16, 1960, at 59, just weeks before his son with his final wife, Kay, was born, a son he never got to meet. Clark Gable remains one of the defining faces of Hollywood's golden age, a legend whose greatest, least publicized role may have been the grief he carried quietly for nearly 2 decades after losing the one marriage that was never for show. Orson Welles changed cinema before he was even 25 years old. Citizen Kane, released in 1941, is still ranked by critics as one of the greatest films ever made. What's less talked about is that Welles spent the next 4 decades never quite escaping that early peak, a shadow that followed him for the rest of his career. His downfall with the studio system started almost immediately. His follow-up film, The Magnificent Ambersons, was taken away from him during editing by RKO Pictures and recut without his approval while he was out of the country. Welles never forgave the industry for that decision, and it marked the beginning of a decades-long struggle to get his projects fully funded and finished on his own terms. That struggle defined the rest of his working life. Welles spent years financing his own films by taking acting jobs, narration work, and commercials, essentially funding his art with paycheck work he often considered beneath him. Several of his most ambitious projects, including Don Quixote and The Other Side of the Wind, remained unfinished for decades, some only pieced together and released long after his death. By the 1970s, Welles had become a completely different public figure than the prodigy of Citizen Kane. His weight had increased significantly, a change he addressed candidly rather than hid, even joking about it during his frequent talk show appearances. Those interviews became known for something specific: his real, genuine skill as a magician. Welles had practiced sleight of hand since childhood, and he regularly performed live card tricks and illusions on air, turning talk show segments into actual magic performances rather than simple conversation. He also became one of the most in-demand voice actors of his era, most famously narrating television commercials, a job that paled next to Citizen Kane but paid reliably in a way his films often didn't. Orson Welles died in 1985 at 70, still working, still pitching new projects until the end. He left behind a debut so influential it reshaped filmmaking permanently, and a career-long fight against an industry that never quite let him repeat it on his own terms. Shelley Winters spent her career refusing to be the glamorous Hollywood type, and she won 2 Academy Awards doing it her own way. Best Supporting Actress for The Diary of Anne Frank in 1959, and again for A Patch of Blue in 1965. But her real story wasn't about polish. It was about a woman who was disarmingly, deliberately honest in an industry built on image control. Winters was famous for saying exactly what she thought in interviews, often to the discomfort of hosts who weren't prepared for it. She spoke openly about her weight, her age, her multiple divorces, and her many high-profile relationships, including a long romance with Burt Lancaster and a marriage to actor Vittorio Gassman, at a time when most actresses were coached to stay carefully vague about their personal lives. She refused the coaching entirely. Her memoirs, published later in her career, were considered shockingly candid for their time, detailing affairs, industry mistreatment, and her own insecurities with a bluntness that made studio publicists uncomfortable. She named names. She didn't soften stories to protect anyone's reputation, including her own. That same unfiltered honesty made her a favorite, unpredictable talk show guest for decades. Hosts loved booking her precisely because she was impossible to script. She would interrupt, overshare, and pivot mid-story without warning, and audiences responded to the authenticity of it, since so few Hollywood interviews at the time felt genuinely unrehearsed. Winters continued acting well into her 70s and 80s, taking character roles in film and television long after many of her peers had faded from view. She never chased youth or tried to disguise her age, treating the passage of time the same way she treated everything else in her life, out loud and without apology. Shelley Winters died in 2006 at 85. She left behind 2 Oscars, a reputation as one of the most fearlessly honest voices Hollywood ever produced, and a career built on refusing to be anyone other than exactly who she was, on camera or off. Richard Burton had one of the most celebrated voices in acting history, a Welsh baritone so powerful that directors built entire scenes around simply letting him speak. 7 Academy Award nominations, none of them wins, a fact that trailed him for his entire career and one he never fully made peace with. His personal life became just as famous as his performances, largely because of Elizabeth Taylor. The two met filming Cleopatra in 1963 while both were married to other people, and their affair became one of the most publicly scrutinized scandals of the decade. They married in 1964, divorced in 1974, remarried in 1975, and divorced again in 1976, a cycle so dramatic the press never stopped covering it. Their combined fame briefly made them the most photographed couple on the planet. Alongside that public romance was a real, long-documented struggle with alcohol. Burton was open about it in interviews, describing his drinking with the same articulate detail he brought to Shakespeare, treating his own addiction almost like a character study. Biographers and those close to him confirmed the dependency was severe for most of his adult life, something he acknowledged rather than concealed on camera. His talk show appearances became known for that same unflinching honesty. He discussed his working-class Welsh upbringing, his complicated relationship with fame, and his drinking with a level of self-awareness that few stars of his era matched. Audiences weren't just watching an actor promote a film. They were watching a genuinely reflective man examine his own contradictions in real time. In his final years, Burton had reportedly begun cutting back on alcohol, determined to reclaim the discipline that made him one of the finest stage actors of his generation. He continued working steadily, including a celebrated return to the stage, right up until the end. Richard Burton died in 1984 at 58 from a brain hemorrhage. He left behind 7 Oscar nominations he never converted into a win, one of the most publicly chronicled love stories in Hollywood history, and a voice that remains a benchmark for what dramatic acting could sound like. Marlon Brando didn't just act differently, he changed what acting was allowed to look like. On the Waterfront, A Streetcar Named Desire, later The Godfather, each performance broke from the polished, theatrical style that dominated before him. Brando brought something rawer, quieter, and far more unpredictable, and Hollywood spent decades trying to catch up. That same unpredictability defined his relationship with the industry itself. Brando was famously contemptuous of talk shows and press obligations, treating publicity as a chore beneath the work itself. When he did appear, he often used the platform to say things studios actively didn't want said, mocking the industry that employed him with the same bluntness he brought to his characters. His most defining act of defiance came in 1973. After winning the Academy Award for The Godfather, Brando refused to accept it. Instead, he sent Sachin Littlefeather, a Native American actress and activist, to the ceremony to decline the award on stage, reading a statement protesting Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans in film. It remains one of the most talked about moments in Oscar history, a real, deliberate confrontation broadcast live to the entire industry. Off-screen, Brando's life was similarly unconventional. He largely withdrew from Hollywood's social scene, living for long stretches on his private island in Tahiti, disinterested in maintaining the glamorous image the industry expected of its biggest stars. He gained significant weight in his later decades, a change he addressed with the same indifference he showed toward most public opinion of him, refusing to perform vanity for cameras that no longer particularly interested him. His personal life carried real tragedy as well. In 1990, his son Christian shot and killed Donnie Harrison's family friend, Dad Drollett, in Brando's own home, a case that dominated headlines and ended in a manslaughter conviction. It was a devastating chapter that Brando rarely discussed publicly afterward. Marlon Brando died in 2004 at 80. He left behind a body of work that permanently redefined screen acting, a legacy of open defiance toward an industry he never fully respected, and a life lived almost entirely on his own terms.